everyone. Welcome to the Devil's Advocate program. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Kevin Bonham, an election expert and polling expert from Tasmania, join us to talk about Australian election and Australian electoral system. So thank you, Dr. Bonham.
Thank you. You're very welcome. It's exciting to be on at such an interesting time in the wake of the South Australian election.
This show's primary target audience is Chinese Australians and Chinese Americans. Many of the audience live in North America as well. And as you're probably aware that most of us in the Chinese diaspora, we grew up in mainland China, and we never had experience of voting and elections. You know, China is a one-party state. So many of us are quite unfamiliar with electoral systems, especially the Australian system. Look, it's very, seems very complex. So maybe let's start by, if you can explain us in a general sense, the Australian electoral system, how it actually works, like the basics for compulsory voting, preferential voting in the House, and proportional voting in the Senate. And what is the single biggest thing Chinese Australian or Chinese American listener would find genuinely strange about the Australian system?
So to start with, compulsory voting in elections in Australia, unless you have a good excuse, you're required to turn up to the ballot box and get yourself ticked off and take a voting paper, or to participate in some other way, like by voting by post. You don't actually have to write anything on the ballot paper. Nobody can check if you just put it in the box blank, which is called an informal vote. It doesn't count. So you're not actually forced to vote as such, but you are forced to get yourself ticked off as having been in the process. So that means that if somebody just doesn't go to the ballot box at all to vote, they will get fined a small amount unless they have a good reason. Strangely, they actually get fined more in state elections than in federal elections. In federal elections, the fine's only $20, which is not very much money. The House of Representatives which is the lower house, has the house where government is formed, has 150 members. They're chosen from local districts around the country called divisions. So everybody votes for their local member, and then those local members determine who forms the government. And the system is that there will be a list of candidates for that seat, and the voter will rank the candidates from the most liked candidate. They put number 1, second most liked, number 2, third most liked, number 3, and so on. This is very similar to what's called ranked choice voting in parts of the US that have it. Basically the same system with some minor differences. And sometimes someone gets more than half the vote on the first count, that person wins. This is increasingly rare. Then the federal election happened in about 1 in every 10 seats. It's just used to be a common thing. Now the votes are spreading out and it's not happening so much anymore. So if nobody gets 50%, then you start with the lowest person, the person with the least votes, and you take them out of the count and you look to see who did their voters want next, and you pass those votes on to the next person. And you keep doing that until somebody wins. You usually, in a lot of seats, you will have 2 candidates who are clearly ahead of everybody else, and all the other votes will wind up with those 2 candidates eventually. Sometimes it is more complex than that.
Can you tell me why does the preference vote counting taken so long in some of the seats? Is that a computer system that can calculate that, or it has to be done manually?
Most of the delay in counting the preferences in Australian elections is for the lower house is caused by waiting for postal votes to come in. Unlike some countries have like the UK has a postal vote deadline. You have to have your vote in by election day. We don't do that. In Australia, there is a deadline several days after election day when you must have your postal vote returned by. And so most of the delay in doing preferences is not caused by the preference system, it's caused by waiting for all these postal votes to trickle in so that they can start doing the process of excluding the lowest candidate, then the next one, and so on. And there are various shortcuts to give an idea of what is going to happen in advance of that process. So in many seats, even though one candidate might have 40%, one candidate might have 30%, but we get enough evidence on the night of the election to know who will win that seat very confidently. So this is a common thing that people say, oh, the preferences, it takes 2 weeks. If you had first past the post, you'd have a result on the night like in the UK. Really, the big difference there is that the UK requires all the votes to be in faster.
You have commented passionately against the anti-preference movement, those right-wing Australians who want to switch to the first past the post system. They believe it will benefit the right wing, and you call this fake patriotism. Can you make the case for why preferential voting is structurally superior, and then tell us, is there any legitimate critique of the preferential voting? Because there must be some disadvantage or negative.
So here it's worth going into the history of preferential voting in Australian federal elections. In the early 20th century, there were at one stage 2 main parties, the Labor Party and a party called the Nationalists, which is the forerunner of today's Liberal Party. New candidates started showing up associated with rural farming groups. And these rural farming group candidates, who later became what is now the National Party, wanted to run against the Nationalists and against Labor. But this caused a problem because in some seats there will be a very conservative vote. So a single Liberal would easily beat Labor. But when the Conservative vote was split between 2 candidates, Labor would win the seat. So Labor was winning Conservative seats that it had no business winning. And people often say that the preferential voting was some kind of conspiracy of the major parties, but actually one major party wanted it so this competition could occur. The other major party didn't want it. And the effect of it, in fact, was that the farming parties started to do very well in certain areas. They started to win seats from the main Conservative Party. So it was actually helping third parties from the start. That's the history. And I believe that a lot of the people who are complaining about the last 2 elections and arguing for the first past the post system are unaware of that history and don't understand the extent to which that history reflects the Australian ideal of a fair go. And these people loudly proclaim their patriotism. They often have Australian flags in their profiles. They're often carrying on about Australia Day, sort of campaigning in a very Trump-like manner and often admiring Trump, but they don't understand the system that they are criticising. So this is why I don't remember when I first came up with this term fake patriot, but I believe that this is not a real patriot movement that understands our country's traditions. I believe it's a pretense and to a degree an important movement. In terms of the benefits of preferential voting, firstly, you don't get the wasted vote problem. the wasted vote problem happens when you have a large number of candidates running for a seat who all have some appeal. They might get 5 or 10%. Anyone who votes for one of those candidates and not for one of the major candidates, their vote doesn't help anyone get elected. Their vote doesn't contribute to the margin between the top two candidates. They may as well not have voted because the margin between the top two candidates is the same whether they vote or not.
We have seen this in the United States, right? I think in 2016, there's a 1 or 2% of Green voters whose vote are totally wasted, and because otherwise, if they have a preferential system, they might have flowed to Hillary Clinton, and Trump will never have won.
Yes, it was a huge controversy in 2000 about whether voters for Ralph Nader, who was the Green Party candidate in that election, caused Al Gore to lose. That was something that was much debated at the time, because that election was decided by one extremely close state. So that's whether they actually did or not is beside the point. The point is that they could have, and so it means that some voters have to decide whether to vote honestly or to vote strategically for a party that may not be their most liked party. It may even be a party they don't like, but they just want to beat a party who they dislike even more. And that's something that affects some voters, but not all voters, because some voters will be voting for a party who they know is going to be one of the leading parties in the seat. I find that extremely unfair, in that some voters are subject to this strategic dilemma and other voters are not. And it's particularly a thing in the UK, where you have so many parties running, and so you get all kinds of tactical voting going on to try to get around this wasted vote problem. Every now and then it fails, and a right-wing candidate wins a very left-wing seat, or a left-wing candidate wins a very right-wing seat, because the opponents can't get their act together and funnel all the votes to one person.
In the French presidential voting system, they have a runoff system. So it's essentially a kind of like a two-step preferential voting, right? So they consolidate two candidates in the second round. What do you think? Is the runoff system better, or the preferential system better?
The point of the preferential system is that it does something very much like a runoff in one go. You only have to go and vote once.
It's more efficient.
Rather than having 2 rounds of voting where you just have more campaigning, sort of more turn out one week, turn out the next. Particularly given that we have compulsory voting, people in Australia probably wouldn't like being forced to the ballot box twice. In countries that have voluntary voting, it's a bit different, because you don't have to go. If you don't think the first round is important, you can skip it. Runoffs do have some. The French runoff system is a bit interesting, because it does allow, in cases for more than 2 people, to get through to the next round. And there were some tactics where more than 2 candidates got through, and some of the candidates withdrew. But your typical 2-candidate runoff. One thing that we have in Australia a lot of 3-cornered contests, where seats where more than 2 parties are seriously competing. In the South Australian election at the moment, we have the seat of Heysen, which is the Liberals have the lead, and Labor and the Greens are fighting very narrowly to see which one will make the final 2. When you have runoffs where the final 2 are being decided by primary votes in the first round, that introduces all kinds of tactics to try to get your preferred candidate into the final 2. Sometimes even that can involve a spoiler candidate. And I prefer our system in that it is harder to manipulate that, even if you wanted to.
So is there any downside to preferential voting?
There are. I mean, so what we have in Australia in most places is called compulsory preferential voting. You must number all the boxes. You can leave the last one blank and you'll get away with that. You can't just number 1 or 2 and stop. New South Wales, one state of Australia, New South Wales, allows you to just number 1, number 2, as many or as few as you like. Queensland is likely to bring that system back as well. They had it for a while. One disadvantage with compulsory preferencing is that voters make mistakes. And a lot of Australian voters, and often this is voters who have a different language background to English. It's particularly a thing in Western Sydney, but it's a thing all around the country where people have a primary language other than English, or where the average education rate is low. Those two things result in a lot of voters making mistakes, and rules need to be set for that to allow some of those votes to be counted. And that's not happening to the extent that I think it should. We had some seats at the last federal election where 17%, 1 in every 6 votes, were not counted because the voter either deliberately didn't fill out the ballot or much more commonly made a mistake. So that is one issue that can be raised. The solution to that isn't to scrap preferential voting. The solution to that is to improve the system. There are some other cases, some of these three-cornered cases that we get. There is an argument that single-seat elections don't work very well for some of these weird seats where you get 3 or 4 candidates fighting it out. And the candidate who finishes third might have beaten both the top 2 head-to-head easily. And it's a matter of debate whether that should occur, whether there's a better system. We also see at some of these elections you get, as we've seen in the federal and the South Australian election, one party gets a bit over a third of the vote and gets 2/3 of the seats. So it's not a proportional system, and some people don't like that.
Well, compulsory voting many times baffles and outrages, especially the Americans, especially the conservative. They think they tramples on their freedom. So what does the evidence actually show about how it changes electoral outcomes? Does it systematically benefit one side, or is it a common claim that advantage Labour actually supported by data?
It's so long since we actually had it in Australia that it's a little hard to say. I have experience with local council elections where we used to have voluntary voting with quite a high turnout, a 60% turnout. And that went over to compulsory voting, and now the turnout is much higher, over 80%. What we were finding with those local council elections was that there was an age skew in who was voting when it was voluntary. So the younger voters were not voting very much. Among the older age groups, virtually everybody was voting. That's council elections. I'm not certain that you get the same thing in federal elections. If you did, then voluntary voting would possibly favour the right somewhat, but it's not completely simple because, for instance, the Greens do very well among young voters, and their young voters tend to be motivated and politically aware and would probably turn out in high numbers. So it might be that what you get will be more of a polarised system rather than a skew to one side.
Our Senate system uses proportional representation, while the House uses preferential in single-member seats. So that combination produces radically different political dynamics in the 2 chambers. Is the tension between the 2 chambers a feature or a bug?
I think the tension between the 2 chambers is great. I think it is excellent to have 2 chambers of parliament that are elected by very different systems, so long as both the systems are good in their own right, because that makes it harder to get bad legislation through. I think it's more important that a parliament stop bad laws from being made, or at least look at them before they are made and think about whether they should be made in that form, rather than that a government always gets its way. Whether that's a government elected by a single seat system, where it's usually a majority party, or whether it's a government elected by proportional representation. In either case, I think that single houses, I think that single houses in either case are risky. And I also think that if you have two chambers that are too similar, what's the point? You can too easily get the same result in both houses. So I think it's good that we have a Senate, which is fairly powerful compared to some upper houses, but not all powerful. There are things the government can do about it if it's too obstructive. I think that there is a good balance in Australia. For those not aware, what happens in the Senate is that at most elections, each state of Australia is electing 6 senators at a time, and there are 6 who will come up in the next election. So they don't all usually change at the same election. And that gives a good way for a party that's polling, a party that's polling 10% of the vote can easily win Senate seats, and parties that are polling 4 or 5% of the vote in certain states will sometimes win them with just because they're left with the most votes remaining, and then they do okay on preferences. The Senate system is very complicated.
I've seen some comments. Some people have argued that the proportional voting system is the best in the world, or the most democratic, the most truly reflected the will of the voters. What do you think? Should we adopt like multi-seat proportional voting for the House?
I think it's something that you can that people can debate either way. I associate with I see a lot of people who are sort of highly educated pushing the proportional representation case, but there are arguments that can be made for having a government that is usually can usually get its own way through the lower house of parliament, and then its legislation has to go to the Senate, and then the Senate decides what to do with it. The proportional house isn't the house of government. My own state, Tasmania, has a proportional lower house elected under a system called the Hare-Clark system that is somewhat similar to the Senate system. It's quite a fun system because candidates compete against other candidates for their own parties as well as against the other parties. So you get fights within parties to get the best candidates rather than having parties just pick whoever they want and say this is your candidate, deal with it. So I get to see the good and the bad in terms of having a proportional system at the state level. Sometimes in proportional representation, you end up with a government that is not the government that the voters would have wanted. An example in my home state was the 1989 election, where the Liberals had a very large lead on primary votes. And if it had been a normal preferential voting election, they would have won the election. But they didn't quite manage to get half the seats. And a Labor and Greens government formed that was quite radical, and that did quite a lot to clean up the mess left by the previous government. But it was not really the voters' choice in terms of who people actually cast their votes for. It just happened that it had one more seat, and all the Greens votes then counted as votes for the Labor government, whether the voters for the Greens would have actually preferred a Labor government or a Liberal government, and some of them would have preferred a Liberal government. So if it was a two-party preferred race, which is the way we decide elections in Australia quite often, you would have got the other side winning. So there are that sort of thing. And there are also cases in proportional representation where a minority party gets a lot of power for its vote share. So I'm not saying these things are crushing arguments against proportional representation. I'm not saying our system is necessarily better, but I am saying it's not clear-cut. A lot of people who support proportional voting for Australia think you can't make a sound argument for the system that we have, preferential voting and single-member electorates, but I think that's wrong.
Now let's compare the American system and the Australian system. If you have to design the American electoral system from scratch using the Australian lessons, what are the top three things you want import into America?
And firstly, I would dig up almost everything and start again. But I think that preferential voting is one, but I don't think that preferential voting fixes the problems in the US by itself. And I also don't think that preferential voting is that easy to implement, to bring in quickly in a place that doesn't have a history of it. It is quite challenging, the issues with ballot design, voter education. It's, I think that it's something that needs to be handled carefully, but that is one part of it. The second part would be institutional neutrality. Our elections are run by a neutral commission of public servants who are not members of a party. You don't get the equivalent of Republicans and Democrats running elections or drawing their own boundaries for elections. You don't get that sort of thing. I would say also that some people think that the difference between the US and Australia is as simple as preferential voting, and if you brought in preferential voting and you had a neutrally run system, that the sort of the big two parties domination in the US will just go away. But I think that's obviously not true, because there are countries that have first past the post voting and that have neutral electoral design that have multiple parties. So it's not, it's not clear that first past the post voting is causing the two-party system in the US by itself. There are other things going on that make it hard to compete with the big parties, and I'm not an expert on those in the US context.
So what features of the Australian system do you think would genuinely not translate well into the American context, either politically or constitutionally?
I'm not sure how you would go with introducing a Senate style, like our sort of Senate, to the US. It's quite a complicated form of voting, and it's one that really works best by paper voting. A lot of the US in a lot of places uses sort of punch card style ballots. They have limitations in terms of the range of systems that you can run with them. If you were going to take something like this into the US, you would need to look at how you would do it. And I don't know that sort of proportional representation will be easy to introduce. I haven't looked at that in the US context.
Donald Trump has a very particular grievance against mail voting, and the irony is that he himself voted multiple times by mail himself. So he thinks he seemed to think that mail-in votes attract fraudulent activity. What's your view?
This is a funny thing. In the US, for whatever reason, postal voting in a lot of places is liked by Democrats, and you get this blue shift where numbers start off favouring the Republicans and then the Democrats catch up. In Australia, it's the reverse. In Australia, postal voting is most commonly used by older voters. The older voters tend to be conservative, and so the Liberal Party will often do something like 7% better on the postal votes than on the day voting. So that's one difference that we have. In Australia, the postal voting as a fraud thing, it's just not really a debate that happens in federal elections. There are some issues with postal voting in terms of the privacy of the ballot. The voter is not casting their vote in private. It's possible that someone is watching them. Someone may be pressuring them. So it's not ideal that people vote by post in that sense. It's something that we have because for some people that's the easiest way for them to do it. But we don't have this constant postal vote fraud debate in Australia. It's just not a feature here.
With the recent South Australian election, there are some right-wing commentaries on social media. They're complaining that even though One Nation got 22% of the vote, primary vote, and they haven't won many seats, and they're crying fraud and cheating. So it seems like there is a direct content pipeline between American right-wing vote fraud obsession, and now it's being introduced into the Australian right-wing commentary. How serious should we take that risk that the American democratic erosion patterns, including the election denial, polling denial, to get imported and normalized here in Australia?
I'm concerned about how much this stuff is coming in Australia. Since the 2025 election, the amount of conspiracy claims about the election result, people saying the result was rigged, people saying that preferential voting rigs elections, this sort of stuff, is much worse than I've seen before. There was a fair amount of it in the previous term too, but it's now quite out of control. You have a party that got a relatively low primary vote. It got 35% of the vote. It won 94 out of 150 seats. And people don't understand how that happened. And a part of it is because the media was telling people it was going to be a really close election. And the media kept telling people it was going to be a really close election, even when the polls had stopped saying that. So to some degree, people on the right, I think, did not expect this outcome, and that's made the Trumpy behaviour worse. In terms of South Australia, what's happened in South Australia has been a bit different. What's happened in South Australia has been that early in the counting, One Nation was showing in a number of places as having won no seats. And that was just because the counts were not finished. And in some cases, the Electoral Commission has a go at working out who will be the top two candidates in a seat. And then on the night, they try to say, okay, if these people will be the top two candidates in this seat, who's going to win? And they put up some figures about that. And those figures were being spread about wildly, but in many cases, they actually had the wrong top two. No one in the Electoral Commission really, I think, expected that One Nation was going to make the top two in more than half the seats. This is something that could have been modelled, but you had to at least believe that the polling was accurate. And they tend to be a bit careful about who they put in these things. So these things have no effect on the result. But numbers were going around saying, sort of like, One Nation's got 35% of the vote in this seat, but this seat's being shown as a race between Liberal and Independent. We're being dudded. But actually, they weren't. That's actually not the count that determines the seat. And so that greatly fueled the conspiracy theory stuff about how, sort of like One Nation's got 22% of the vote. They're not getting any seats. They must be being cheated. Some of it also comes from the fact that One Nation is not going to win many seats. They may win 4, but that's still a lot less than 22%. And this is just a feature that the parties that leads on primary votes in a single member voting system will tend to get a big share of seats. And a party that's well behind on primary vote, getting 22% when you've got a leader on 38%, is not going to get very many seats. And this is the same whether you have preferences or not. It's the same in the UK. We saw in the UK this is one thing that I think the people complaining about preferences, particularly those who are waving the Australian flag which has the Union Jack in the corner, they should pay attention to UK elections. At the last UK election, Labor got 33.7% of the vote. They won 411 out of 650 seats. So it's nothing. That's nothing to do with preferential voting because they don't have it. So a lot of it's just people not understanding the properties of a single member electoral system.
One Nation capitalized on economic grievances and anti-immigration sentiment. And especially, I think their surge started in aftermath of the Bondi terror attack. So how much of the South Australia result for One Nation can be attributed to that specific post-Bondi terror attack moment versus long-term structural trends, including the Liberal collapse and Gina Rinehardt's contribution and the global right shift, the populist surge?
I actually trace it to the 2025 federal election. The 2025 federal election, One Nation have been building their vote share off grievances with immigration and a few other things for some time, but they still didn't they didn't increase their vote by very much.
Yeah. They only got 5%.
They got 6.4%.
Okay.
So ever since the federal election, their vote started growing, and the growth got faster and faster, snowballed. It seems to have slowed down recently, but there was a rapid sort of spreading of their vote. And I think Bondi, you can't even, when I do a graph, of how One Nation's vote has been going in polls. We now know from South Australia that these polls are probably real. When I do a graph of that, you can't really pick out Bondi and say, oh, here's a massive shift that was caused by the Bondi thing. For sure, the Bondi thing was good for One Nation's messaging because they thrive on creating an environment where people are scared of outsiders. So it's the kind of thing that they would exploit. But I think that it's really mainly driven by the coalition's woeful performance in the 2025 federal election. And voters said, well, we weren't very keen on the coalition at that election. We tried to support them anyway to stop Labor, but they did terribly. Why should we keep voting for them? And there are other things in the mix there, but I think that's the trigger point. I think the election itself was the trigger point for people who had all these grievances moving over to One Nation. And also at the same time, once One Nation got more popular, they started to attract people who are not all in line with their ideas, people who are just wanting to give the major parties a kicking, because there's a lot of it's quite trendy in Australia all the time to complain about the major parties.
Okay, so now let's talk about the Liberal Party's collapse. The coalition has split twice in the past year. They've gone through multiple leaders, and Angus Taylor now appears to be considering shifting the Liberals further to the right to counter One Nation on immigration. Is this a viable strategy, or does moving rightwards to chase One Nation voters simply accelerate the loss of the moderate multicultural metro seats that Liberal no longer can afford to lose?
It's a very hard question what the Liberal Party should do about the mess that it finds itself in. I think that at the election, they managed to annoy both the moderates and the right-wing voters at the same time. It was particularly over the Donald Trump thing. You had a sort of a right-wing fringe going, the Liberal Party is not Trumpy enough, and you had a lot of moderates going, the Liberal Party is too Trumpy, and they didn't pick one, and so they tended to be victims of both perceptions. I really do not know whether the Liberal Party can actually fix what has happened here. It may be that One Nation will collapse again. One Nation has a history of collapsing. Most MPs who have been elected as One Nation members in any parliament in Australia have not lasted a term without quitting the parliament, quitting the party, or being thrown out of the party, or being disqualified. So that sort of the fact that One Nation has a history of being unstable may find that over time that this current surge collapses. But if you look at the UK with Reform's polling is tailing off a bit, but they're still there after years of this stuff. It seems like the Liberal Party has a serious problem.
I live in Bradfield, which is a traditional Liberal blue ribbon seat, but it turns into independent at the last election. I think, and one of the key reasons is that there's about a quarter of the voters here in Bradfield are actually Chinese Australians, and the Liberal at the last election, Peter Dutton has a very strong kind of anti-China messaging. He constantly warned about possible war with China, and I think that turned up a lot of the Chinese Australian voters, even though most of them are traditionally conservative, small c conservative. They are natural conservative voters, but they are very worried about the very hostile language used by Peter Dutton, and that's probably why there's quite a few other major metropolitan seats that used to lean Liberal, but because of the many Chinese voters living in those areas, they kind of turn independent. So with One Nation's rise, they have a huge image problem with Chinese Australian voters because Pauline Hanson's famous maiden speech back about 20 years ago, the anti-Asian immigration speech. So this creates the huge problem, I think, for the Liberals, because if One Nation keep rising, and many of the metropolitan seats where the Chinese Australian voters congregate, they will have an even bigger problem, because if the voters associate One Nation with the Liberals, if they form a loose coalition, that's even more bad news for the Liberals, isn't it?
This was also a very big thing in the 2022 election. There were several seats with high Chinese Australian populations that swung very heavily to Labor in that election. And One Nation do very badly in inner metro seats, and associating with them is not a good thing. There's a question even if the coalition recommends that people give preferences to One Nation, so they might say vote one for us, vote two for for One Nation. Parties do this to parties put out cards to recommend to their supporters how to fill out the ballot paper. Most voters don't actually follow them, but there's a lot of theatre around these cards and a lot of myths about how much influence they have. So if the coalition is saying vote 1 for us, vote 2 for One Nation, in some of those seats, that alone will get them heavily criticised.
I can imagine Labour doing advertisement, just using Pauline Hanson's speech and then targeting those Chinese voters, right?
Yes, and the sort of the memory of what One Nation was like when Hanson first appeared in politics in the 1990s has not faded. I think people know that even though it may move from time to time as to which group she will attack, One Nation could come back and attack any group at any time.
So the problem identified by analysts is that any coalition attempt at a credible immigration reduction policy will get immediately undercut by One Nation demanding more cuts, go further, maybe in the end, zero net immigration. And so the Liberals can never out One Nation on that regard. So what is the left? What is left for Liberals to do? What is the actual substantive policy space where the Liberals can credibly differentiate themselves from both One Nation on the right and Labour on the left?
Immigration policy is not something that I'm an expert in, to the point of being able to say here is a policy you should run with that will do well at filling the gap between the two parties. I would say that in general, yes, there is a risk to the Liberals if they try to be too much like One Nation. All they're going to get is One Nation saying, hey, we were here first, you've stolen our policies again, you're just a pale imitation of us. We are the original. We've been doing this for 30 years. It's not, I think that going way to the right, as some Liberals who are already on the right want to do, is not the solution. And the party has to find some kind of space that's well defined, where they can say, this is what we stand for and why. We're not just sitting in the middle for the sake of it, but we're offering something different.
You mentioned just now that One Nation had traditionally had many problems in the organization, many members quitting or having problems inside their organization. So this time, do they have better funding and better candidates and better branch structure this time? Do you foresee a better party?
When I looked at their candidates in South Australia, I was often impressed on paper by the skills of some of the candidates they managed to attract in some of their stronger seats. It's like as they're getting more popular, they're starting to attract more significant people in the community, sort of more sort of local councillors, business people, that sort of thing. So I think that they can, from that perspective, that they can look at having better candidates for their best seats. They still have problems that they struggle to find enough candidates to run everywhere, and a lot of the candidates they run turn out to have problems. They're often found to have candidates who have said really offensive things on social media, or who have serious legal issues. So that's something that they're still not on top of.
One Nation surge is flowing almost exclusively from former coalition voters, and also with the National Party split from the coalition and the ongoing Liberal leadership instability. So is the coalition as a formal federal arrangement now structurally at risk? What would a reconfigured Australian right Conservative actually look like if it isn't a Liberal national coalition?
Some of the polling-based models that are coming out at the moment are saying that if there was an election held right now, the National Party will be wiped out completely. It will be completely, because One Nation polls so strongly in those sort of in the rural areas when they are doing well. The suggestion is that One Nation will be polling 40 or 45% of the vote in these seats and taking the Nationals vote away from them so much that the Nationals just lose all their seats. I think from what we've seen in South Australia, it's not so simple. I think that the strong Nationals local MPs will hold their seats. I think that they, you know, some of the Nationals MPs are extremely popular within their own seats. A good example is Darren Chester in the seat of Gippsland. He's one of the more moderate Nationals, and he gets a huge votes. And I think that people like that, One Nation will not beat. But the second tier sorts of seats, they're going to cause the Nationals a huge amount of trouble. And the Nationals really have a question of how they remain relevant in this situation.
With the One Nation surge, is there a chance that Pauline Hanson will like copy what Donald Trump has done in the US, basically capture the Republican Party with a populist right-wing insurgency? Or do you think our preferential voting system actually prevent that kind of full institutional takeover?
There's a view around where a lot of people say, oh, you know, sort of like One Nation will never take over because preferential voting always favours the centre, and so it won't happen. I'm not completely convinced of that view. I do see you do get seats where the Liberal Party will get excluded in third. We're having some of those in South Australia. And Liberal Party voters do tend to follow these how to vote cards more than other voters. And so if the Liberal Party is telling its voters to give preferences to One Nation, then One Nation can win seats. It's not, you know, the system does not stop them to the extent that people might think that it does. And I would caution people on the left not to take too lightly the chance that One Nation can do fairly well under preferential voting. That is provided that the Liberal Party keeps recommending preferences to them. If at some point the Liberal Party decides to start recommending preferences to Labor, then it will be very hard for One Nation to win seats. And the only places they will win seats is some unusual rural areas where their vote is extremely strong. They might be looking at a handful of seats nationwide in that case on their current vote share.
With One Nation's primary vote polling at like over 20%, is there they're actually more than the Liberals at the moment. So is there a chance that One Nation will become the major Conservative party in Australia?
We haven't seen that in South Australia yet. In the election that we just saw, the One Nation outpolled the Liberals, but it looks like the Liberals will probably get more seats. But it is possible when we've got some polls where One Nation federally is beating the Liberals by 8%, 28 to 20 or something like that. If you see those numbers at a federal election, then One Nation will become the opposition unless, again, the coalition recommends that its voters give preferences to Labor. That's the important disclaimer that I always have to add. But there's potential for it at the moment, but it's a very long way to the next election.
Labor won a federal landslide last year and a state landslide last week. So what does Labor's current federal position actually look like on the numbers? Is it the split on the right structurally beneficial for Labor, or does it carry its long-term risk that's not obvious yet?
I should say here that during the second half of the last term, Labor was often polling quite badly. They were polling to a point where if an election was held at some stages in the term, it looked like they might not win. And then they surged in the last few months with a big helping hand from Trump, I think. The point at which Trump became president again was exactly the point at which Labor's vote started ticking upwards. But Labor is again not polling that well on the primary vote. Its primary vote is dropped down from the 34, 35 that it got at the election to seeing a lot of 29%, 30%, that kind of level. And Labor is losing votes to One Nation as well at the moment. And Labor lost votes to One Nation in parts of South Australia. There's One Nation in some areas. One Nation can fight for Labor with Labor for votes that the Liberals would never get. The sort of the traditional blue collar suburbs. We have one seat that Labor won. They had 70% to 30% after preferences last election. This election, Labor versus One Nation, it's going to finish very close, 52-48. So massively closer. It is partly because the sitting Labor member retired, but it is possible if Labor don't do too well. There's the chance that they get squeezed. There's a chance that the Liberals do well in some of the suburb seats and One Nation does well everywhere else. And between them, the Liberals and One Nation take more seats off Labor than you'd otherwise expect. So it's not so simple as to say that Labor is currently cruising to another easy win. The way polls are going, they wouldn't have to slip much further before you say Labor will be falling into minority.
Especially with the current global, maybe a risk of global recession. Is it? So if with the next 1 or 2 years, if we enter in economic hardship, that's very bad news for the sitting government. Is it?
Yes, even the current fuel prices, massive spike in petrol prices in Australia since the Iran war broke out. That's something that governments don't want to have to deal with for too long because historically that's not very good for your polling.
Going back to your previously you mentioned, there is a commentary from especially right-wing social media accounts. They're saying that Labor only got like 30% of the primary vote. It's not democratic. They don't represent the will of Australian voters. They're not a legitimate government. What's the best answer to that complaint?
So somebody has to govern the country. Labor had 34.6% of the vote. Coalition had 31.8%. So Labor was head on primary votes. When you look at the preferences of the people who didn't vote for either, they preferred Labor strongly, about 60% to 40% of the rest. So those two things between them meant that Labor was preferred to the coalition by over 55% of voters. So if you're going to pick a government, people might say, oh, I don't like a government winning from 34.6%, winning a majority, but there was nobody with more. They were, in fact, Labor were preferred to the coalition by the biggest head-to-head margin in 50 years. So despite their modest primary vote, it was a massive win. And the only question here really is, do you want a single member system or a proportional system? If you had a proportional system instead, what we will probably now have is a government of Labor and the Greens. You'll definitely not have a right-wing government. It will be Labor plus the Greens, or Labor plus the Greens plus the Teal Independents, or something. It will be a Labor government. So it's not like any different system would have changed the outcome at all. The way that Labor won so many seats is people are sort of saying that this is because of preferential voting, but it's actually mostly not. A lot of it was because Labor's primary vote was much better distributed than the coalitions. There were a lot of seats, including some of the teal seats, where Labor got basically hardly any votes in the House of Representatives. They got more votes in the Senate. So there were Labor's primary vote was dragged down by seats where it had no chance of winning anyway. And when you take those seats out and just look at the average seat, in the average seat, Labor was winning convincingly. They were 5% ahead of the coalition on primary votes, going further ahead on preferences. The average seats that decide that typically decide who the winners and losers are of the elections. So Labor were, as a result of all that, already ahead on primaries in 86 seats. So preferences only added a small number of seats to that. But it's a hard thing to get across to people who just take a look at sort of like 35% of the vote and 55% of the seats, or 63% of the seats. It must be preferential voting. It's actually not. It's actually a property of single member electorates plus the way their vote was spread about.
Last question. You've written about the structural vulnerabilities in Australian polling, including the online effects, the past vote weighing, herding, and the last two elections, the polls were quite wrong, I think, in the lead up to the election. What would have to take to have a genuine 2019 style failure where the wrong winner is predicted in the polling? Are any of those vulnerabilities present in the current polling environment right now?
It's always a risk when you have a lot of Australian elections are actually very close. It's quite common that the two-party vote is 52-48 or closer. There's only a few points in it. So there's always that risk that there is an industry-wide failure of a few percent. In 2019, the pollsters uniformly said that Labor was slightly ahead and the coalition narrowly won. In 2025, the pollsters were off by about the same amount. But because it was the difference between a modest victory and a huge victory, rather than the difference between getting the right result and getting the wrong result, almost nobody cared. There was far less, the amount of media attention on the polls following the 2025 election was only about a few percent of what it was like after 2019. When the polls get it wrong, you get a lot of fuss about it. The industry has become a lot more transparent since 2019, and I hope that's helping. But what went on in 2025 has still not been investigated thoroughly as to why the pollsters underestimated Labor in the great majority of cases.
Thanks so much, Dr. Bonham, for taking the time and for your expertise on the election matters. I learned a new word doing the research. It's a psephologist, right? Psephologist. I've never heard of the word before, actually.
Yes, it comes from a Greek word meaning pebbles, as in little rocks, and sort of elections were at some point counted using these things. So that's where the term originates from. It's basically the study of voting and voter behaviour and things that are relevant to that, including opinion polls.
Well, it's fascinating subjects for our political junkies, I guess. All right. So thanks very much, Dr. Bonham, and on behalf of listeners, thank you.
Thank you very much.